I just want to get back to the topic that I was in the middle of um, exploring an interpretive model of. Basically, I'm exploring a therapeutic model uh, of how to accumulate some kind of journey and pathway for meta development of being able to command one's type and extricate oneself um, from the type, essentially, get to that point. Now, I know that I keep on bringing politics into it, and is perhaps would be more fortunate if I were to plan what I say exactly. But I do feel that it can be a very good example, the kind of the political analogy, because there is so much of a psychological drive in the very immature form of identity politics. Is a huge example. You know, it's so baseless and intellectually pathetic that and how it has to kind of disguise and conceal its its cognitive dissonance. You can almost see in real time. Well, if you compare it to some of the dynamics that I want to bring up in terms of, I was trying to go through different species of arrested development and different species of um, different forms of immaturity um, that types will often produce. I do think that the first and actually I've done some later thinking on this, and I have actually come. This is a lot of people are going to easily sort of dismiss my work, I guess, from what I'm about to say, but um, it had me thinking about a scriptural passage, uh, which is quite a curious passage. It's something that Jesus says when he says that I have come to divide, not to unite. Uh, Father against son and son against father, and then it says mother against daughter and daughter against mother, and then it says mother-in-law against daughter-in-law and daughter-in-law against mother-in-law. And just earlier, or in the middle of that, it says I have come to divide three against two and two against three. Now, you will notice that those numbers don't quite add up. Because if there is a father and a son as opposing each other, and a mother and a daughter opposing each other, and a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law opposing each other, uh, that is asymmetrical to start off with. That there isn't talk of a father-in-law, um, and it says specifically two against three, and three against two. So yeah, a lot of people might see this as a far-reaching thing. To me, it's not even that important. I'm not invoking it as a source of authority, but as a model to understand it. I actually think that it actually is a useful way of actually working out a therapeutic means, because you see, the problem with the four sides of the mind essentially is that it is entrenched in some level, even in my ontological interpretation of it. It has too many symmetries within it, and if something is balanced, it will never reach a point of resolution. It will never be able to kind of unwind itself. It can only spiral more tightly into itself and become more solid in some sense. And so the only way to actually break the system is to interpret it in such a way so as to create an asymmetry which then can be used essentially to dismantle the whole thing. And using the analogy of mother-daughter, father-son, and mother-in-law, daughter-in-law, I have been able to concoct such an asymmetry. And I'm going to just talk through that. And I'm not using this as, I mean, to me, it's not important that this came from scripture, but as an analogy, it's useful enough. And I mean, some people would even, I can imagine, they're hypothetical and skeptical critiques at me assigning which gender goes to which side of the mind and which, anyway. So basically, I think that it would be correct to conceive of, in light of my ontological deconstruction of the four sides of the mind, that the superego is the mother, and the unconscious is the father, and the subconscious is the daughter, and the ego is the son. And so the very first thing that has to occur is that the son and the father, which is actually mentioned first, have to be in conflict and opposed to one another. That is the first gate, or that's the first step of development, that those things have to actually be antagonized with one another. When the ego is simply dealing with the subconscious, almost to the exclusion or the complete nescience of the unconscious, that the unconscious is just a kind of, so it's like, to use the Matrix analogy, this is before Neo hears about that the world is actually a matrix and that there's an architect in some room somewhere, that's actually generating the delusion that is the subconscious, in some sense, that is the kind of the cause behind the subconscious projection, or hypothetical kind of, anyway. So the thing about the subconscious really is the battleground, because if you want these things to cancel each other out, in some sense you need the ego to be in some kind of equilibrium with the superego, and you need the unconscious to be in some equilibrium with the subconscious, which is, well, no, I think that diagonal actually is probably never going to happen because of the ontological flow of why these things led to one another. Well, in some indirect way that is correct, because obviously the unconscious is implicitly antagonistic to the superego, which it just kind of actually ignores and negates as just being the reality, the world itself. So the superego is somewhat the environmental consciousness, in some sense, or the environmental character and personification, or something like that. So it's not even seen, it's just the medium of fatalism, determinism. It's like a kind of pantheistic character. It is the essence of the it's like if you were a fish and the water was the superego. Now that essentially leads to the unconscious needing to generate something else, like the subconscious, so that it's actually capable of navigating the water, so that it can be kind of attuned to the water, that it can sort of actually have some level of acclimatizing itself to its environment and still have a kind of mastery over it. And so the subconscious is somewhat compatible with the unconscious mind. And so it is able to navigate the currents in the water in the fish tank, or something like that. So it has this transparent substance, the superego, but there are still forces that transparency is happening in, that it has to be able to kind of have strong fins that it can sort of deal with it, and it can maneuver within it, and it can in fact power itself within the but it doesn't. So the positive. So in some sense, the reason why it can ignore the superego is because it has the subconscious to kind of to deploy and sort of and conceptualize the issues of. Now, the problem is that it is the maker of the subconscious. The unconscious mind is the maker of the subconscious, and as soon as the subconscious is kind of close to being fully conceptualized and contemplated and completed, then it operates. It operates as a kind of pervasive lawgiver over that matrix. So just like the architect in the Matrix. And so it really is like a puppet master. It has agents that it is almost simulating and conceiving of the operation thereof. And so it's generally a conception of a system of powers and value, how value works, and such. So it's a kind of conceptual mesh that is woven upon the world, and it is like the knowledge of the application of the power that is held by the command power that is held by the unconscious mind, that is somewhat symbolizing its mastery of the subconscious, of the superego. So there is a kind of indirect symmetry here, but it's not when it's the mastery of the superego. It's more like the dominance of the superego, and this is not an active thing; it's an implicit thing, because it's such a, well, maybe mastery and dominance is the wrong thing. It's more like the displacement. It is, yeah. So it's the displacement, and then the subconscious is the mark of the self-sufficiency of the unconscious. What existentially, what really the unconscious suffers from is that it is fundamentally solipsistic in essence, and if the subconscious gets so unstable that it kind of rearranges those functions into acting out the personification of the if the model flips and inverts, then the unconscious mind itself essentially has a loss of confidence in itself. It has a kind of, its dignity sort of switches off like a light switch, and then the superego really operates in the vacuum of the dignity of the unconscious, but still in the same role as the subconscious. Sorry, as the unconscious. So the dignity. So if the subconscious inverts, essentially, because it's like the matrix collapses because of instability, the dignity of the unconscious flips off like a light switch, and the superego inherits that role for itself. So it's actually the subconscious goes rogue in essence. That is what's happening when the superego is being channeled. It's not actually the superego that's switched on. It's actually that the subconscious has adopted uh, the unconscious's dignity and its seat of so in some sense the subconscious goes rogue. It's a master of itself, but it can only do that essentially by displacing the unconscious, and it does that essentially by inverting itself and becoming the superego. But it is not actually in the role of the superego, which is just the kind of environmental condition. It's just a kind of so the superego itself is more so just marked by its passivity to the dominance of the unconscious. How did I just speak on that earlier? I called it displacement. The superego is merely displaced. It is the thing that is displaced. In the unconscious's setting, natural project of the subconscious. But it was even displaced before that because the unconscious wanted to negate the existence of the superego. It's more that the superego is in a form of is this the wrong word? Inviolable. I need to look at that definition, I guess, before I. Anyway, let me just move on. Okay, so talking about those dynamics, let me just move on. So you want the ego and the unconscious to first have their natural falling out, which most people, this is what is generally regarded as some kind of adult maturity, which you would at least hope starts to develop around the early 20s, like 21, 22 is probably closer to maybe 23. But some people can be very immature in this way for almost forever, because some people can be locked in. I would say that there are some forms of supposed intellectualism which are just, they are essentially, although their functions gain more experience, they're stuck in the same configuration as when they were 4 or 5 years old, and there has literally been no fluidity in terms of moving on to another internal configuration, and I think I did get into some of this in one of my recordings, perhaps the Esoteric Psychology ones, where I think what happens is that essentially the unconscious never gets unmasked by the ego, and the ego is just constantly delved into the subconscious and is constantly sort of fighting the same recurring drama or battle. So there's just this persistent drama that just has this kind of loop recurrence in it, and it's just not, it's never picked up that is internal, or that the dishonesty of that engagement, and the dishonesty of that sort of recurring drama is never identified as being self-caused, and therefore the unconscious essentially is just or the unconscious influence over the subconscious is just projected as an exterior condition within the context of the subconscious. So the subconscious is just being interfered with by exterior agencies and not by an interior source. Anyway, so okay, so that would be the first thing. So I think generally two things have to happen. You have to let the ego deconstruct the unconscious, but you also have to let the superego deconstruct the ego somewhat simultaneously. And so those things are somewhat symmetrical. And so in the same way that the unconscious is susceptible to the ego, which it naturally is susceptible, it naturally is weak to be displaced, or not displaced, but to be dismantled. But at the same time that the ego undermines the unconscious, it at the same time creates instability in its own subconscious. And that is fundamentally the door for the superego to start to challenge the ego and to start to make very strange waves. And then at some point, the subconscious itself is identified as the kind of as the nexus of the inherent dysfunction and the kind of, and I think that many people, they get some insight and some maturity, but they don't identify the subconscious as being fundamentally the sort of the apex of self delusional, kind of just recurring nonsense and immaturity. And you get this in that people have a very vague sense of purpose. It's so wishy-washy. It's just a kind of, they're just shooting the shit. That's the kind of level of investment, and where it's kind of, everyone is allowed some almost ceremonial modicum of a kind of integrity, but enough integrity just so that everyone gets to have their way in sort of sort of building up a mini Tower of Babel to have it, kind of collapse like a Jenga game that is being sort of, and so you're just kind of reveling in a kind of somewhat a rudderless culture of interpersonal so it's a kind of like an interpersonal dependency, but there's no real the dependency is in a kind of frivolity. So it's a kind of like there isn't much at stake. It's just a kind of continual activity, but it's kind of redundant and sort of, and so in that sense it's kind of circular and dead in that respect, that it's just a kind of atrophied disposition of a kind of relented idea that there can be some kind of true north, or that there can be a purpose that is actually able of conserving its own value in some sense and building upon that value and reaching something, and being constructive and proactive. These are the kind of are anathema concepts that are essentially constantly deconstructed by the behavior of the culture itself in some sense. And it really, when I say culture, I mean these are species and styles of intellectual disposition. And there are forms of this that get into very stable philosophical structures that perform these functions. And intersectional identity politics would basically be of that species. It's a kind of like, it's a kind of, let's all just agree in some form of nihilism. So let's just say that this is a good lowest common denominator way of prosecuting our agendas, and this is how we can sort of, be separate but equal. This is the poison pill, is that it if you reduce it to a principle, it's just nonsense. It doesn't. It's fundamentally inconsistent. It will it can be called self-coherent in as much as it debases, so much as that it's okay to kind of have a kind of completely hollow sense of integrity. And so it does this by essentially uh, replacing dignity with sympathy. Um, so there are all these sorts of, it has a lot of strange mechanics around it. It's very vile, and uh, it's always intricate and convoluted, basically, so that it can sort of disguise, conceal these layers of dysfunction from itself. And it somewhat knows that it's got a kind of tautological circular kind of regress within it, but it doesn't care, because it almost doesn't think that there's anything that it would be worth the time to strive for as an alternative to that mode. Um, okay, that's enough said about that. So a lot of people, it's interesting. I find it very interesting, because you see, the more gates you continue down the road of, right, the more progress you make in these steps, in a sense, the more toxic and pathological you are in the uh, in the in the kind of in the influence that you have. So I find it quite interesting that, so if you sort of, the more developed you are, but then arrested at that stage, uh, the greater the kind of the or the cultural cost to you inhabit. The more toxic, the more nuanced the toxin that is generated by that level of sort of atrophy, or the more decadent, rather, as well. Now, the real problem with identity politics, effectively, is that, I mean, it's fascist morality, it's fascist ideology. Um, it doesn't have individual principles, so it has this way coded into it. It has this objective to sort of reduce the world into a way in which people can be stably subconsciously focused, and see themselves as intricately sophisticated, and trade in their dignity for some sense of kind of collective signaling of high status. So it has this kind of uh the problem is that that value has to be extracted from something, and so they have to find a scapegoat, essentially, to basically pay for the high status. They have to generate the high status out of some kind of collective narrative or mythology around, uh, you know, a a source of certainty. So it's like, if you don't naturally feel something, if it is because of some condition that you have to feel it, then you need something that provides that condition. And when that is based on a kind of collective narrative, the only way to prove that, uh, sorry, I'm not speaking in the clearest things, because this is it's quite a hard thing to describe, but I will just kind of, through analogy and through kind of intimating how it kind of works, hopefully I will be able to describe it well enough. Um, that essentially, value itself is a very strange thing. That value can actually be philosophically ascertained, in some certain ways. Um, Obviously, this kind of ideology value is generated by a kind of collective fiat, of a kind of, that you plug yourself into, this cloud consensus, this moral majority sort of way of being. Um, but then how that can conserve or sustain a sense of high status or value that it's offering its people, it can only do that by showing them a real sacrifice, essentially. Because one of the things about value, in some sense, or integrity, is that it can only be proven um, by a willingness to sacrifice. And so their willingness to, exterminate their enemy, to be more radical, to ramp up the violence or whatever, to sort of um, in as much as so their willingness to do these things, these are the marks of their virtue, and it is evidence of the certainty that is needed to fuel the ideology. So it becomes a vampire thing, and to keep the sympathy that drives the ideology alive. So the sympathy is like the lifeblood in the slave morality, and the only way to keep the sympathy, delivering energy around the body, um, is to is to is to substantiate that with their willingness to actuate the body into being able to perform some new feat, some new radical transgression. It's very interesting that I think that the kind of delusion, because the subconscious is fundamentally flawed. That's why the ego even develops to kind of critique it from the outside, and to limit it to a large extent. So creating a culture that is subconscious focused is like, is just a doomed project to begin with. It's not going to fly. And in fact, very quickly, even people that get into this kind of politics, they know that there's a very difference between the backroom occult kind of esoteric leadership and the kind of the pleb ideology. That there's a stark divide, because they, in some sense, even they know the limitations of their own ideology, how it has to be ruled from the top down. It has to be a very strict concentration of power, Gestapo type, you know, um, interventions and such. They have to have an invisible uh, uh, intermediary filtering system, to kind of make sure that it all flows as the ideology would otherwise dictate. You know, I mean, it's easier to disguise that when you're just the underdog, but when you actually have some kind of, when you gain power, then how do you use it? It gets it starts to fall all over the place quite quickly. Once you actually temper that kind of uh, that blithe ideological fervor with any kind of real responsibility, because then the factors that are overlooked by the oversimplifications and the ideology have to be catered to, and because they're not catered to by the ideology, they have to be catered to in secret in some sense, or they have to be compensated for in secret. And so the gaps in the ideology have to be filled, um, uh, either through exteriorizing blame when failures occur, or by not letting the failures occur, by essentially installing a completely different system that just gives lip service to the ideology. This is the distinction that Hitler made between the useful idiots and the very compromised, overt fascism that essentially can only sustain one identity. That's the only difference, essentially, between what I would call these proto-fascist identitarians or intersectional people and full-blown fascism, is that the fascists understand that you can only promote one identity, whereas intersectional people think that somehow all the layers of identity will receive their due in order or something like that. But the real fascists know how retarded that is, how impossible it is. That you can't have a state that serves more than one master. And the intersectional claims do not coincide. They are inconsistent and incompatible with one another. And so essentially, you have to either agree to have a kind of, well, let's just go our separate ways and live in our separate spheres of influence and have, like ethno states based on identity. That's the only way to have a stable kind of solution to it, which the fascists will actually, whereas if you just stay with being a kind of intersectional person, it's just like it might be more ideologically honest and sustainable in some sense, but practically it would be a complete disaster from day one. Nothing would work. You would have to have ad hoc administrators. There would be no. I mean, it would completely abolish the rule of law, as it already threatens in many cases. Anyway, this is too much of a tangent. I wanted to get into. But these are the kinds of these are the kinds of complexities and problems that are sort of inherent within the kind of the subconscious confine. And so when you have a culture that's centered around having a, a continued subconscious that doesn't sort of relent itself to the ego, to then kind of have the ego try to have another go at it, which eventually the ego is exhausted by that. That's what most people are doing in their teens, especially. That's what most people are doing when they are growing up, is they are trying to find the ceiling and the limit in their subconscious so that they can start seeing how the unconscious is actually has its hand, has its puppeteering kind of how because the ego can only reach the subconscious. The ego can only reach the unconscious through the subconscious. Well, that's not true. I guess technically it reaches it through its. Technically, well, it's been said that it reaches it through the inferior function, but let me think about that for a second. But I've also left a thread that I wanted to speak about in particular. No, that's not. No, it's not the inferior function. Some people used to say no. No, I'm just remembering it wrong. That's the inferior function is how people get to the subconscious. Yeah, that's yeah. Never mind. Okay. Um, so my point is that what did I go past? So I was talking about the subconscious primarily, so that I could get into the issue of Oh, wanted to add a point about the unhealthy aspect of the subconscious that also related to cultures that focus on it. Oh, yes, the point about transgression. Let me think if I can remember this. I came up with a phrase which I thought was very poignant. It had something to do with the translation, no, the reimagining, no, the redeployment, no, the reinterpretation that was closer to it. The alteration, no, the adjustment to transgression. I can't remember now, but the reimagining of transgression. That is the only way to hide the cognitive dissonance, essentially, the complexities that are packaged within the subconscious, the inherent self-contradictions and such. The only way that can that the subconscious can protect itself in allowing a person to stay subconscious focused is by having this very fluid reappointment, no, I can't remember the word, but it was better than that. But basically, the power of just constantly translating transgression, and you can understand this because that becomes the engine of oversight, essentially, that you can just have this kind of selective oversight that is convenient to preserving the very fragile structure, and the kind of, and the very, sort of crazy, cherry-picked, kind of perspectives that are required to keep that ecosystem running smoothly. Now, it is interesting because essentially the ego, something very strange happens to the ego when you're subconscious focused. I haven't thought about that too much. But I think the thing about transgression does have something closely tied to it. But generally what's happened when you're subconscious focused is that there is a kind of collusion between the ego and the unconscious. And eventually that kind of ups the ante, and it keeps on upping the ante within the subconscious. And the only way, and that someone has to take the fall for that. Someone eventually has to sort of, there's a kind of sword of Damocles that is getting wound up, and it's spinning out of control, and someone's head has to be under that sword, and that is required just to keep the collusion between the unconscious and the ego running smoothly. And so and that is what you're confronted with when you see, these identitarian ideologues. Now you see the fascists. I think they are a stage of maturity further, because they actually know that kind of stupidity. They just have a kind of jaded and callous, compromised sense of, well, we know that this is how it, but like they have this weird sympathy. They're like, well, there's so many people in society that will never be able to have real dignity or understand things, so we need to preserve a culture that is good for stupid people, that is good for people to just kind of follow along and let their betters control their lives, essentially. That's the kind of the fascist position, is that you have this kind of strange kind of it's basically just characterized as a kind of pervasive paternalism to preserve your gene pool or something like that, or to preserve your identity. And the only thing that keeps it hanging together as this kind of attachment to some kind of superficial tag that is weirdly probably represented by the superego or something like that. That there's a way of warding off the superego, um, so that the ego essentially can be in control. So I would just say that, that's the difference between the useful idiots and the fascists. So that the fascists are ego driven, and the useful idiots are just subconsciously self-deluded, and therefore much more intricate and so-called and sophisticated in their ideologuing and their intelligentsia kind of stuff. And this is probably also, it's strange because the fascist society does have both elements. They keep the spirit of the useful idiot alive. They still kind of pander to it rhetorically. That's part of the fascist delivery mechanism in how it always masks itself as being of the left. I mean, fascism has never not promoted itself as a socialist movement. We must know that historically. What is disgusting is how they have essentially been able to infiltrate young children's minds by the very strange kind of control over like very very nuanced psychological things that are creating a whole new generation of people that have such a warped sense of morality that it's all based on this kind of collective superficial thing that has no kind of individual principles attached to it. That bullying is not being included in friend circles. It's that kind of deconstruction and demolishing of the interpersonal dimension in life. It's just this kind of, you have authority, you have guilty people, you have innocent people, and everyone has to sort of pander to this pervasive moral authority. It's this idea that anything that takes people out of their comfort zone, which is basically code for subconscious focus, is just is the wrong thing. You're not being sympathetic. They'll say you're not being compassionate enough, but it's really that you're not being sympathetic. And sympathy is the lifeblood of essentially that level of subconscious focused pathological realm of being. Anyway, I've kind of run out of steam now. I was going to get on to that. The way of dismantling the whole thing, I believe, is to have a kind of disdaining subconscious drama where you are actually in the matrix, you are actually resolving it through the matrix, where essentially you have a simulated exchange between the superego and the child function of the subconscious. And you do that essentially by having the fundamental divide and the fundamental way of actually generating enough understanding of the internal architecture is between the parent function and the child function in the subconscious. And I believe that the child function in the subconscious represents the superego, essentially. The superego which was long forgotten. But the way to get to grips with the superego and to confront one's primal trauma and primal hurt is through essentially trying to develop the child function in the subconscious to the level of the parent function in the superego, but that's a virtual juxtaposition. And essentially you are trying to displace the dedication offered to it by the parent function in the subconscious. And so actually, to go back to my scriptural reference, then you would have something like the child function in the subconscious would actually be the mother-in-law, and the parent function in the subconscious would be the daughter-in-law, and that would be the basis upon which you create the rift between them, and they must be in opposing quarters. And so generally I think you would have the father, the mother, and the mother-in-law in the set of three, and you would have the son and the daughter-in-law in the set of two, and those two would be opposed to one another. Although I think I might be wrong about this, but I think that the mother-in-law and the daughter-in-law could be on opposite sides. They could swap quarters, but as long as they're on opposing sides, that might be okay. Now I might be wrong about making that statement. Either it's just important that they are on opposite sides, and maybe they have to be in the sides that I originally depicted, but maybe they can actually alternate, and then you kind of gain knowledge both ways in with their different consort, and you just keep on, as long as those two are on opposite sides. Then you've got the 2 against 3 and the 3 against 2. And that asymmetry and that is basically by removing the daughter. You're displacing the daughter. So in the 3 against 2 and 2 against 3, I did not say daughter. I only said mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, and those together essentially represent the daughter, because they're both two of the keyest elements, I would say. The mother-in-law being the representative of the motivation, because it's the child function, and the daughter-in-law being representative of the dedication to the child function. Now, when you separate dedication, when you have an opposing motivation and dedication, essentially what happens is the motivation becomes negated. It becomes dead, and because the dedication is opposed to the motivation, it can't be dedication anymore. So I was going to read out because I really wrote a lot of stuff about this, but I'm too tired. But I will elaborate on, because that will get very laborious actually. But now I've sort of laid it all out. That's good enough. It'll probably be very hard to listen to, but the next recording will just be me reading the notes that I made on this topic, now that I've just kind of laid it out in the narrative almost.